On the 26th of February, 1957, a box was found in a thicket of trees in the neighborhood of Fox Chase, and the contents of that box would create one of the longest cold cases in history. A few days earlier, 18-year-old John was on his way into a little wooded area. He was there to check traps that he had put down the day before. So eager to see what he had caught, John made his way into the small thicket of trees, hoping that one of his traps would contain a rabbit. After checking his traps, he was a bit disappointed as he had not caught anything. But as John was making his way out of the wooded area, he noticed something poking out of the long grass. At first, it just looked like a bit of rubbish, a cardboard box someone had thrown away. John, slightly interested by the rubbish, edged closer towards the box to see if he could see what was inside. But inside was just an odd-looking doll. Now feeling a bit weirded out, John left the wooded area and headed home. The next day, a 26-year-old man named Frederick pulled up at the side of that same road and walked into that same wooded area, and he too would come across that same cardboard box. Wanting to know what was inside, John moved closer to the box and saw the same doll, except this was no doll. John was certain that this was a real person. Completely freaked out, John ran out of the trees, leapt straight into his car, and drove off. Previous to this, John had gained a bad reputation of staring for long periods of time into the girls' school right next to where the box was located. Because of this, he was very reluctant to tell authorities what he had discovered, worried that he would be arrested himself. Unsure of what to do, John went to the church and talked to some of the priests, including his brother, who urged him to tell the authorities what he had found. So that's exactly what John would do. The following day, on a cold, rainy Tuesday, police officer Elmer Palmer would arrive at the location of the box. He pulled up his patrol car, stepped out and walked into the little thicket of trees, and upon gazing at the box, it would not take Elmer long to determine that this was not the doll, but in fact the naked body of an extremely malnourished boy, beaten and bruised with surgical scars on various parts of his body. Despite his distressing condition, he appeared surprisingly well groomed, with recently trimmed hair and fingernails. There was also a fluorescent blue dye in the iris of his left eye. He was wrapped in a blanket inside a cardboard box labelled "Fragile, handle with care." Elmer had not been at the scene long before calling it in over the radio. Soon after, a nun from the girls' school just over the road had seen the police car outside and wanted to know what was happening. Before Elmer could stop her, she saw the boy in the box. Shocked at the sight, she immediately turned away and began praying to God. Shortly after, a police captain, 2 detectives, and an ambulance arrived at the scene. Once the body was taken in and the investigation would start, detectives initially thought this would be a quick and easy case and they would soon find the perpetrators. But when no missing person reports matched the boy, it became impossible to identify the body. In a desperate attempt to get an ID for the boy, authorities would take the body of the boy and prop him upright whilst taking photographs, hoping someone would be able to recognize him. A few leads would be received from this, but eventually all these trails would go cold. After this, the case would officially be closed, although some private investigators would still continue to search for the answers, but ultimately would result in nothing. As the months turned to years, the case turned cold and the boy in the box was forgotten to history. Until 1998, when the case was reopened by Detective Tom Augustine, along with the Vidocq Society, a private investigatory unit, in the hopes that newer technology would help solve the case. But the DNA tests, unfortunately, were not conclusive enough, and they could still not identify the body. However, they were able to rule out people who had previously been suspects. On top of this, it gained a lot more media attention and would be the highlight for an episode of a show called America's Most Wanted. This would bring in 150 new tips as members of the public phoned in with possible information. One of these people was a physician that said he received a phone call late at night from one of his patients, who we will be referring to as Mary. Mary was ringing to tell him of a burden she'd been carrying for so long and she had to get it off her chest. This would eventually lead to Mary telling police the horrifying story of her childhood. Mary remembers often being hungry as a child. Daughter to Marjorie and James Davis, she was also often a victim of abuse from both her father and mother. Mary remembers one day when she was 13 years old, her mother Marjorie took her out in the car. They pulled up outside a house and her mother walked up to the door. A woman opened the door and handed her mother a baby boy. Her mother then handed the woman an envelope. She said goodbye and came back to the car. They drove home, and once they arrived, Marjorie said that the boy can't stay in the house and that he has to stay in the basement. She would then get a cardboard box, a blanket, and a couple of dog bowls and place them down in the basement along with the boy. When her mother would go down into the basement, she was often down there for long periods of time, much longer than the time required just to feed him. Mary wasn't allowed to go down into the basement unless she was going down with her mother. When she was down there, she doesn't remember the boy ever saying a word. He would just sit there in silence. One night a week, the boy would get a bath in the upstairs of the house. On one of these nights, Marjorie was running a bath. She placed the boy into the water, which was still far too hot. The boy started screaming and thrashing around, causing Marjorie to get wet, which angered her so much she started screaming at the boy until he went quiet. Soon after, he would be sick in the bath. Enraging Marjorie further, she yanked the boy out of the bath and began beating and pummeling him viciously with her fists, until the boy lay lifeless. The boy would later be identified in 2022 as Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Given Marjorie's reputation of abusing her own daughter, it brings forth the question of what happened to that boy in that basement before he died. It will always remain speculation, but no matter which way it is looked upon, the reality is truly horrific. Mary's story could be completely true and is believed among many, as a lot of things do add up, but it was never made official, and so to this day the boy in the box remains unsolved.